Okay.
I'll go ahead and start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Ayub, Sheriff in Ventura County, California, and I am the State Sheriff's Association representative to the RIPA board.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Edgar Hampton. I'm the current president of the Anaheim Police Association, also the director and president of the Orange County chapter of PORAC, and an executive board member of PORAC. If for those of you that are not aware, PORAC is Peace Officer Research Association of California, and it's got about 76,000 sworn law enforcement members within that organization. I represent PORAC as a board member here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abdul Pridgen. I'm the chief of the San Leandro Police Department, and I am the immediate past president of the California Police Chiefs Association as of last week. So I've got a lot more time on my hands, just kidding. And then I represent roughly 338 active chiefs and another probably 300 to 400 retired chiefs. So I'm their representative on the board. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Raphael. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy, UC Berkeley, and I'm the representative of the governor's office.
I think we can go ahead with the agenda for now because we're still trying to reach her. And then hopefully when she comes on, she can introduce herself. Officer Hampton, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I just realized that. The next step would be the approval of the August 24, 2021 meeting minutes. If everyone has taken a look at that, we would just need the motion and then the vote for the approval of the meeting minutes.
I so move.
I second the motion.
Okay, we have first and a second. All in
Second.
favor of approval? All in favor and approval of those the August 24, 2021 meeting minutes? Aye.
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 Aye. Any opposition or abstention from approval of the minutes? Hearing none, that motion carries. Thank you. The next would be the overview by the Department of Justice. I think that's. Is there any way to put that up on the to share that screen, Allison?
For the agenda or the
No, ma'am. Just the overview by the DOJ.
Oh, we actually don't have any screen sharing for this. This is just a we just wanted to talk with you all about kind of the purpose of the meeting and what we'd all love for you to do and discuss during the meeting. Really, what we sent to all of you was the draft of the calls for service section last year, just so you could have a sense of what what the subcommittee and the board discussed for the calls for service section. And really, that was the lead in to wanting to have a good discussion at this meeting of what you all would like the report what topics you all would like the report to cover this next year in the report. And so this is really the meeting to help determine the direction of the report for the calls for service subcommittee. And so it's really up to all of you. We did cover a variety of topics last year, so there may be some follow-up on those that you're interested in. I know we had a discussion with the co-chairs to plan for this meeting and talked about some different topics, but that's really, this meeting is really to set the stage for the year to come and what you're all interested in. And trying to really focus attention so we're not trying to cover 10 different topics. Our goal is to also make the report a little bit shorter this next year. And I think that's a goal shared by everybody. But still cover the topics that you're all interested in. So we'd really like to hear from all of you. And the hope is to come out of this meeting with a good sense of what areas you all wish to focus on for the year. And also, if they're, in planning for the next subcommittee meeting, we will have report outs to the full board at the March 30th meeting from each subcommittee. So that will give the full board a sense of what you're all interested in working on and how it all fits together. And then we can plan for the next subcommittee meetings. And if you all want any experts on various topics to come, talk to the subcommittee or further research, that's really what we love to hear from all of you by the end of this meeting. But that's basically it. Our update is really to just open the door to all of you and what you're interested in covering in this next year's report, based on what we did last year, and other topics that you might be interested in exploring.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions about any of that before the discussion?
Nope.
Okay, great. I'll turn it back to all of you. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll offer some initial thoughts. I remember, I believe it was last year in the Calls for Service Subcommittee, we had presentations from this, I think the Director of Emergency Management in San Francisco. And
Yes.
he gave a very, it was very illuminating, and it's really stuck with me in terms of they were trying to implement a response for calls for service when somebody was in distress with a mental health issue, and oftentimes covering sort of the realm of kind of homelessness issues, where they were having an EMT and a nurse and a social worker kind of show up together. And I thought that if I remember correctly, it was kind of in a pilot stage, and we had very interesting conversation regarding whether the model would work in some of the more rural counties, or the counties that have bigger sort of geographic areas and that are more spread out. And I wonder if it's worthwhile revisiting to see how things are going there a year later, and maybe if we could find something in San Bernardino or Ventura or the Central Valley, or where there might be a similar effort. Maybe we can learn a little bit about how kind of triaging these types of calls, if there are different models out there that are being experimented with across the state.
So, Steve, I think that's a great idea. We should definitely have them back. I can also say that we have, and we briefly discussed it in the pre-meeting meeting, that the City of Anaheim has a psychiatric emergency response team. We call it PERT. Those guys would absolutely love to come on and talk about what they do. That kind of dovetails into what I would like to keep discussing, is the training that dispatchers need to have to make sure that because that's where the weak link in the chain is always going to be. It's always going to be, does a dispatcher know that, is this a call for service that would require, if your agency has it, some sort of psychiatric response versus a uniformed police officer response, and knowing the differences there, all those pre-arrival questions and pre-arrival instructions that might be useful. So I think that I agree, having them back to kind of see where are we now type discussion, and then I can account for Anaheim, to have some guys from the Anaheim psychiatric response unit come and discuss what they do, why they do it that way, everything else like that.
I agree with Dr. Raphael. I wasn't present on this subcommittee when that presentation was made, but in reviewing the information, I feels like we're just sort of dipping our toes in the water at this point, and I'd really like to hear more about how that all works. Locally in Ventura County, we've had a crisis response team composed of mental health care professionals for the better part of 30 years, and the question is availability and the investment in that type of model for responding, at all hours. And that's very often why it falls back to police officers and deputies in the field, is there's that investment in that piece as a full-time response model. I don't think is there in most communities. So more data would be certainly useful in that area for me.
And Sheriff Ayub, I think also I know that there are grants. I know that that's where we were successful in getting a grant for that component that you just talked about, the 24-hour aspect of it. So now we have a daytime crew and a nighttime crew as a result of the grant. So I think that's something that I don't know if that was I don't know who that grant was through, whether it was a DOJ, whether it was a state or federal. I don't know, but I could probably get some subject matter experts to weigh in on that as well.
That'd be terrific for us. So funding's always a big, part of the big challenge for making those things work. Thank you for that.
Is the issue that the calls for service are, or those particular calls for service at night is lower in density, and so it's hard to keep it staffed 24 hours?
So having not been on some of the other subcommittee meetings, the only thing I'd share is, I think there's value in bringing them back to see what lessons have been learned, how successful it has been. When I was in Seaside prior to getting to San Leandro, the city actually hired their own professionals to respond to substance use disorder, mental health or behavioral health crisis, homelessness, and domestic violence. And they've got 3 people, and they staff them based upon the call volume, and that could change over time. So it might be worthwhile because that's a unique model, and police don't go, and it's through a county dispatch center. Some jurisdictions have the luxury of having their own communication center, so they can do the type of training because it's only them. But this is unique because it's a county-wide dispatch, and this particular carve-out is only for one agency in an entire county, that they respond in a certain way and triage calls in a certain way. So it would be interesting to determine where they are in that process, because I left before it became fully fledged, and see how successful it's been. But I know it was well received by the community because, as we all hear quite often, there are calls, and we acknowledge that, where police don't need to go, but there's no one else, and so we show up, and sometimes things don't go as well as we would like. So that might be an opportunity to have them come in and share their lessons learned and where they are.
Can I switch gears to another topic I'd really like to hear more about? And one of the key takeaways in this year's report was the breakdown in communication from our dispatch center to our officers in the field. And we've talked in other forums about the rollout of Next Generation 911 in our communities. And I believe Tuolumne County was the first to go. And we have others that are following suit very, very quickly in terms of the implementation of Next Generation 911. I really think that technology is going to boost the ability to share information and communicate at a completely different level. And I expect some really good outcomes related to the implementation of that as we move forward with that throughout the state.
So Sheriff Ayub, I remember we had discussed getting that information from my chief. We are going to be rolling it out. He told me March, late March, beginning of April for the 911 Live, and so that's when we'll start rolling that out for Anaheim Police Department, and we'll see how that works out, because I think it'll be interesting to actually have the officers responding, hearing that actual 911 call and the interaction between the person on the line and the dispatcher. I think that's always helpful. So we'll be able to, after a few months of that, we should be able to weigh in on some feedback on with that.
The only other thing, and I know this is probably a no-brainer, and this is probably going to be done, and I know we're focused on dispatchers and call takers and the training they receive to ask the pertinent questions to determine whether or not it's just someone in a location that might appear out of place for someone, or whether it's criminal activity, which will require or should necessitate a police response. But I'd be interested to see who has been trained and the kind of training they've had and what are the outcomes. Because the end of the day, we want to make sure that the outcomes are impacted by the training that we provide. So I would want to see what kind of training has a particular call center had with respect to what questions to ask and how to ask them, and does that change how community members are impacted by those calls for service and whether or not police respond. So that's a critical component that we must certainly take into account. It's not just the training, but it's also the outcomes.
So last year, I think we were invited to participate in a few. I can't remember the name of the organization, but I did attend a meeting at some point where it was a sort of central organization of dispatchers, and they were discussing training issues. And I think we may have even had the opportunity to. I mean, they had invited several members to find a local dispatcher to actually have a sort of day of sitting in and seeing how things work. And then I for some reason I recall that maybe there was the ability for us to attend a training. And I don't. The one meeting I had gone to, there were a lot of, at least among the dispatchers there, a lot of nuanced concerns about some of the things that Ripper was recommending, and I thought that it was quite insightful. But it might be worthwhile, at least if we have a clean agenda now, to spend time building that relationship and trying to learn more and think about ways we can make productive recommendations for the dispatchers, understanding a little bit more about their jobs. I mean, obviously, you all know it much better than I do, but I think for the other board members, it would be instructive.
So I remember that meeting as well, Steve, and I do remember one of the things that we had discussed during that time frame too is that Post should be involved in getting that training to them. For example, we just my entire department, we just went through the SB2 mandated de-escalation training, right? So we were able to get every single sworn officer pushed through that. But then at the end of all that training, I asked, hey, are dispatchers going through this de-escalation training? And they weren't. So again, once again, right, the weak link in that chain is there's a drop off between what the training should be for our dispatchers versus what the officers are getting. Obviously, there's going to be it's not going to be exactly the same, but in my opinion, there should be some crossover, especially when you're discussing that bias by proxy and things like that. I think that's it would do a lot better to make sure that they're getting the similar training that the officers in the field are getting. So I do recall that. I do recall that that we had asked to be looped in on that. And from what I understand, I think they were also going to address what Post was requiring, something like that. I think that was a component that they were going to look at.
I did want to let you all know that the newest board member, Tamani Taylor, is also on the line. So, Tamani, if you're able to unmute yourself, are you able to introduce yourself briefly since you missed the introductions earlier? Okay, I'm not sure. I see she's on, but we'll try again in a little bit to make sure she can introduce herself as well.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself. Were you?
No problem.
I'm sorry. I'm running late. I've been running late all day for everything. And so I'm trying to multitask. And so I do apologize. I'm Tamani Taylor. I'm Chief Deputy Public Defender with the Solano County Public Defender's Office. I am appointed by the California Public Defenders Association to the RIPA board. I am replacing Brendan Woods, and I picked to be on this particular subcommittee because I really am interested in calls for service and some of the issues that are occurring, one within our state, but also around the country with regards to calls for service. And so I'm really interested in assisting in figuring out ways that we can address some of those issues. And so I'm really thankful that you guys allowed me to be part of the subcommittee, and I hope to be able to add some input and some insight based on my perspective and what I do. And I don't know if there was anything else that I might have missed.
No, that's great.
Otherwise, I'm thankful and grateful to be on the subcommittee and on the RIPA board.
Welcome.
Oh, I guess I should open my camera so you guys can see me, maybe. How do I do that? Oh, I don't know if I can do that. Oh, maybe I can't do that. Thank you.
So, Tamani, we are, I guess we're discussing priorities for things to investigate in this year's report with regards to calls for service. And we had some discussion about alternative responses to mental health and substance use calls, and then issues about Next Gen 911. And then we're kind of talking about the intersection of dispatcher training and bias by proxy. But we'd love to hear anything, or anything that you think is particularly relevant that maybe we could look into this year.
Well, I do think I have done some work and some research on alternative response teams for mental health, especially and substance abuse, substance crisis related calls, especially particularly where it's family members. That is one topic I'm particularly interested in, and I've studied some other organizations in Oregon and other places where they've implemented those types of responses. I've not actually really thought about any other alternatives, but I'm happy to brainstorm and submit any additional information if I can think of some. I apologize. Like I said, I've been behind all day, so I'm a little scatterbrained right now.
Well, that does make me think if we are going to pursue alternative responses, I wonder if it might be worthwhile thinking about something like National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, or I think that's the name of the organization. That's family members of people with serious mental illness, and if we might hear from a representative about that decision to call for service or not call for service, and the things that people have, the issues that come up, and some of the challenges that families face trying to care for their loved ones. That might be I don't think we've ever done that before on the RIPA board, and it's clearly relevant to our conversation.
And I actually did a Know Your Rights for a local, they're called NAMI, and I'm for some reason
That's
yeah, and I did a Know Your Rights because they for Solano County they did approach me because they were very concerned with we had a situation where an autistic young man had been. The police were called because of a physical assault that had gone on, and the police officers' response when they arrived towards the young man who had autism was video recorded, and so that triggered a response from family members with family members who suffer from mental illness, and so really discussing and addressing their concerns and the fears that they had was really insightful. Because you can't tell them that there's a uniform response to have in any situation, because every situation is different and every agency that is responding is different. So, NAMI is definitely a great agency to reach out to for that kind of information.
Maybe can I ask a question? I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this, but is it common for large law enforcement agencies to have a public relations officer that interfaces with families of people who have mental illness, who have concern about, if they're just so people know, is there a way to that a family, say with a family member where they think that someone might call them on them mistakenly, or the response might be different, if there's a way to let officers or a local law enforcement agency know and sort of be prepared to for that situation. I have no idea if that's something that NAMI even advocates for, or if that's an issue, but it's an interesting one, I think.
I want to speak to that real quick. We run a jail system and, of course, a patrol force. And something we have looked at, we've got what we call a therapeutic inmate management unit in our jail system, and it's got a number of components to it. But one that works extremely well for us is our staff's connection with the mentally ill inmate's family. And we're able to have these conversations, particularly if the inmate falls into some sort of crisis, ways in which to help that person get through that difficult time, and or to learn about triggers that could set off crisis-like behavior. And we've wrestled with a way to try and do that in a patrol environment through cataloging the mentally ill that we encounter through the field interview process, and then creating some sort of database with that information in it that our deputies can access in the field in a timely way, so that it may lead to better outcomes. Something we're looking at doing and would like to really see move forward, but it does have some problems, HIPAA and that sort of thing that we're trying to work through.
I think, again, this is where that component of some sort of premises history or something like that's in our database, our CAD system, for lack of a better word, where you can illustrate. We had a similar incident where we had an adult autistic male. He's a big kid too. He's about 6'4", 250, somewhere around there. He's a big kid, but he was a hugger, and that's what he would do. When he would get out of the house, he would run around and hug people. So we sat down with the parents of the adult, and we put a bunch of premise history in, and we explained that, hey, these are the things, so that these calls don't come out as some sort of assault in progress or something like that, because that will definitely, elicit a different response than a call for service where, hey, my autistic adult son is running around, hugging people. So it's a little bit different, stuff like that. But I think, to your point, Steve, I think that would be fantastic to have some sort of training or some sort of input where you can explain, hey, these are the keywords you need to make sure that you're putting into that call for service or something like that. I think that's huge. We have a similar program for our juveniles with regards to contact with the police, similar to like the know your rights type issues where you explain, hey, these are the things, these are why you're being asked to do, these whatever it is the officer's asking you, and here are here are your rights as a juvenile that you can discuss with whoever you're being contacted by. But I think that there's definitely value in something like that.
Allison, did we miss any other germane points from the 2021 report and 2022 report?
I don't believe so. I mean, so it's really a matter of, are there additional topics if we want to? So it sounds like, at least from what I've been hearing from all of you, you want to continue exploring training for dispatchers and this connection between dispatch and LEOs in the field. I was wondering, actually, Sheriff Ayub, if you could, because there are community members and others who might not be as familiar with the new 911 systems, if you could just explain those so everyone on the call just has a better understanding before we move on to the other topics of just what that might entail.
Sure, I'll do my best. There's a great deal of data online. It's a national effort to improve 911 communications. Of course, that's a nationwide thing. 911 exists all throughout the United States. Locally here in California, we have a 911 advisory board, which I'm a member of, and the program is administered by our state's Office of Emergency Services, and it's extremely complex. There's a rollout of equipment and software that's in progress statewide. It started in Tuolumne County, I believe, and is pushing to other parts of the state, and it involves updating hardware and software related to the 911 system. And what it will afford us to do is to incorporate texts to emergency services. Most agencies have the ability for members of the public to send texts to emergency response centers, communication centers, and share information that they may not be able to communicate verbally, or perhaps they don't have a service that allows them to complete a cellular call. And there's the ability to share photos and video and digital media. So the idea is that not only will we improve infrastructure, improve the serviceability of what's an aging 911 infrastructure in the state, it will allow us to expand our capabilities to share data to emergency services and from emergency services communication centers to deputy sheriffs, police officers, state officers out in the field. So we expect that a lot of the things that we see from breakdowns in communication, and not that this is a fix, but it's certainly an improvement that is going to give us better outcomes, better awareness in the field, and certainly when our our officers in the field have more information, and they can operate in a more efficient, smarter, better way for serving our communities. So it's an exciting thing to see happen. Unfortunately, it's moving a lot slower than us impatient people want. But we're going to see that. Anaheim PD is coming online pretty soon. I really am excited to hear about a major metropolitan areas service improvement related to next generation 911. Really good stuff, and our communities are going to be better and safer, and so are our police officers because of it.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like there's some interest in going deeper into these types of systems and connections, and exploring that, exploring and following up on the crisis response, the various models of the crisis response teams, perhaps finding some way to connect with families as well, during those encounters, and then looking at various models that you have all talked about, Anaheim and Ventura, potentially Seaside, and looking at how the different models are, what the outcomes are, looking back at SFPD and revisiting that and seeing where they are, because they were just at the beginning of their pilot project last year when they were reported out to the subcommittee. So certainly some ideas for the next subcommittee meeting in terms of what you all, and who we might be able to have come talk to the subcommittee and shed further light on this. And also, Chief Pridgen, you I think made an excellent point in terms of looking at not only lessons learned, but also looking at outcomes, because I think that with all of these different models is a really important, we just had a call with the co-chairs for the policies and accountability subcommittee that meeting is happening next week, and just thinking about accountability overall, and it's something the board I know has expressed a lot of interest in pursuing, and so this can also be an area where we look at accountability in these types of models, and whether I know SFPD did report, and they do have metrics for outcomes, and so looking at, sounds like Seaside does as well, and so looking at different potential outcomes and measurements of the effectiveness of the various models too. I do remember from the SFPD there were statistics where they diverted. I don't have the numbers offhand, but they diverted a pretty large number of calls from armed law enforcement, and they hadn't had any. This is just at the beginning of the year, but they hadn't had any where they had to call law enforcement for backup. So that's a huge savings, both of resources, but also of different outcomes for the community members as well. So there are other. And just exploring in more detail, the dispatch training, we can reconnect with the Dispatch Advisory Council that some of you all had connected with last year, so we can do more outreach to see if there are further meetings that some of the newer board members can attend, or if they have anything that they could that they want to bring to the subcommittee. For all of you, and then there were some data that you all explored last year in terms of using the RIPA data to look at some calls for service outcomes. So there may be other areas of interest. I don't know if you all have any ideas about some of the data. I know we had broken down some of the calls for service data last year at the request of Chief Swing and others, and so I don't know if there are other data requests that you all would have that might be able to use the RIPA data if there's anything in particular any of you are interested in terms of the data we collect with RIPA, whether there's any data that you all might be interested in using to explore some of the topics you're interested in.
Well, I mean, I recall from last year that there was a pretty deep dive on differential outcomes for people with disabilities and in particular people with severe mental illness. And so I mean, one way for us to think about it, of course, we can reproduce with this year's data, and it'll probably look the same. But it may also open up an opportunity for us to think about ways to, mitigate the arrests and mitigate, some of the potentially really bad things that could come. And just hearing about the next gen 911, it would be kind of fascinating if there was, and I know that there are HIPAA issues and legal issues, but could you imagine a situation where like a trusted family member's number was there and was called when a crisis, or someone that could perhaps diffuse a situation before it got out of hand, or I don't know, but it sounds like the functionality of that system sounds kind of amazing, and I wonder maybe if we can think creatively about ways. And so for that reason, again, I would emphasize if there's some way we can get somebody from NAMI or families of people that are caring for relatives or that might offer us some sort of firsthand experience insight. I think that would be a useful thing for us to hear, and a useful group for us to hear from.
I agree. I can tell you that our PERT team, in the 2 years that they've been fully up and running, has had in the thousands of calls they've responded to, one use of force. So, and unfortunately, that's not going to be really cited anywhere because it was one use of force, right? So it's not because it's not. We don't document when we don't use force, so that I think we lose a lot of that data on how many times that's actually effective, because we don't, document. Hey, on this date, this time, the officers that responded with the licensed clinician didn't use force. You know what I mean? We kind of don't track that. And I think that, to your point, I think that would be an interesting way to look at the outcomes. And I think Chief Pridgeon spoke on that earlier as well, as the outcomes are important too, to gauge the success of all these different programs. Because in my opinion, obviously, I'm biased, but I think that the PERT team that we put together in Anaheim does a pretty good job.
And that could be something too that, if you all were interested in reviewing data on calls for service and use of force, that's a type of data breakdowns we might be able to do. So, along the lines of what you're saying, Officer Hampton, but thinking about what data, obviously some of the data will come from these agencies themselves, and the tracking of it. And that could be something, of course, that the subcommittee can explore with different models, and looking at outcomes and eventually potentially make recommendations about effectiveness of different models based on outcomes, or best practices, and at a minimum actually tracking the outcomes that that are happening both before and after. I know just from the presentation that SFPD, the task force, did to this subcommittee, that they were, closely tracking a lot of those metrics, and I'm sure other agencies are as well. So reporting out and exploring, that type of data, but that comes from the agencies. So we can also think about how to use the RIPA data as well. And then thinking about, again, this goes back to dispatch and goes back to, just responding to these calls in general, but thinking about identifying calls that can be diverted and how that is, trained, how dispatchers are trained in that. Whether I know in certain models, crisis response teams are part of, essentially part of the 911 calls, but, thinking about that as well, if you all have thoughts about that. Are there any other topics that you all, can think of that a lot of these are all, intersectional and affect each other and, have a lot of, there are a lot of interwoven concepts, in terms of bias by proxy, bias-based calls and dispatch and training and crisis intervention. So it sounds like a lot of the topics you're all interested in pursuing are kind of continuations of what the subcommittee has been doing for the past few years and building up to, and really following up in those areas. And if there are data requests that you all can think of, the data is coming through by April 1st for all of the agencies that collected data last year. So as we start to think about data needs and requests for analysis, if you all have ideas now about anything that you might want the research center to think about analyzing, that would be great to discuss a little bit. And I should note too, it looks like the final subcommittee member, Manju, was able to join the meeting as well. So we now have a full subcommittee on.
One thing that I'm thinking of as we're pondering what to consider is the other side of it, calls for service and diversions or referrals, things that don't result in an arrest, where it's something a favorable outcome. That's not something we often measure, but is that something that we can do? There are times when officers show up and they could take someone to jail, they could cite them, and they don't. So what alternatives did they provide? Was it a resource that they connected them to? Was it a juvenile and they referred them to some youth program to give them a mentor? Those are good things to track because officers are doing that every day, and we often overlook those things.
Is that enough of bunch of was that enough of the data points and talking points that we would need to move forward to the uh, uh, to the next item of the agenda?
I think so. I guess I would ask Manju, I know you joined late. We were just talking about the direction of the report for this next year. And just to very quickly summarize, we've talked about exploring further a lot of the same topics that this subcommittee has touched on already and introduced, but going further and looking at outcomes for training for dispatchers and both in communication with um, the law enforcement officers in the field and the 911 live systems that are being developed and rolled out that have more of a direct connection between officers and dispatchers. We've talked about thinking about how to divert calls and how and when to divert calls and how dispatchers can recognize. Thinking about the following up on the various crisis response models, including SFPD that did a presentation last year, but looking into other agencies and their models as well, and looking at outcomes from those models. And connecting also, potentially with someone from NAMI or families of people with mental illness in terms of thinking about continuing to think about best practices for law enforcement officers, in their interactions. So I think that's a lot of what was covered.
Yeah, thank you, Allison, for summarizing that. It all sounds good. I wonder too, and please tell me if it's not pertinent here, but in the work we're doing as part of Stop AAPI Hate, we've been working with local law enforcement on how to address and refer hate incidents that don't involve crimes, and how you take it out of the sort of criminal law enforcement piece, which of course law enforcement officers are which is not appropriate for them to deal with, given that they are not crimes, and b a more appropriate mechanism is when cities and counties do have alternatives for reporting hate incidents. So I wonder, given the increase we've seen across the board against communities of color and other marginalized groups, if that might be something to add to the mix.
Other thoughts on that from the subcommittee members, and ideas maybe around thinking about that?
That might be something interesting to look at. I think that was in some of the material where there were bias, I can't remember what the term is, but teams really comprised of members of the community that would go out and try to educate, combat, and support those who might have been victims of a hate incident that didn't rise to the level of a crime, or even if it did. So
And Manju, I guess one question for, I think Chief Pridgeon is right that we, did discuss a little bit in the report last year. The subcommittee looked at the bias response teams in New York. That may have been the only one that was found. That, there may be others, but how would you connect that to calls for service that are coming in through, um, coming into dispatch to the officers?
Right. So I'll give you an example. There was a young Asian American woman who was experiencing some sexual harassment that was racialized by another customer at a restaurant in Los Angeles. And so she called 911. The police officers came to the site, and because it was verbal harassment and didn't involve any, threats of injury or physical injury to her, they appropriately said, sorry, ma'am, there's nothing we can do. And then they left without offering her any other help. And so here in Los Angeles, what would have been appropriate is a minimum of them giving her a resource card that we've helped LAPD develop to address hate incidents, and possibly also referring her to LA versus Hate, which is out of the LA County Human Relations Commission, which specifically, and 211, which they could also give her the 211 number, obviously, and she would then call and report her incident to 211 and get help that way, rather than simply leaving her without any help or support. Does that help?
Yes, and I'm curious if anyone else on the subcommittee is aware of other similar, and Manju, if you wouldn't, we would love to see that resource card. I don't know if it's online, but if not, we'd love to see a copy of it. And is anyone else on the call aware of any other agencies that are developing that, or that might have something similar as a resource? And if not, that's something else, we might be able to explore. I know just from the research presented in the report last year, the rise in hate and bias incidents that, sometimes do involve a crime or a threat, but sometimes are more verbal harassment of the type that Manju is talking about, have been on the rise, particularly against the AAPI community in the last year or two. But, many other communities experience these as well. And so it would be interesting to look at whether any other agencies are developing similar responses, or similar responses that any of you might know about that are being, looked into or developed.
I would say that in my conversations with other sheriffs and chiefs, that sharing victim, if you will, and I don't necessarily mean the victim of a crime, but victim resources with members of the public is something that's widely done throughout the state. We have just numerous resources cards for a variety of different things that we encounter that aren't necessarily criminal in nature. Sometimes they are, but that we share with members of the public that we encounter that could use those resources. 211 is a great example, but there are also the information cards. So I don't know how you'd quantify it through calls for service or through RIPA data collection. I think that would be challenging, but I think from a policy perspective, it's certainly good business.
Well, if there's no further discussion from, if any of the subcommittee members have anything else they'd like to discuss, we can do that now. If there is no further discussion, then Edgar and Bill, I think we can move to public comment.
Good to go.
Are there any members of the public who wish to make public comment? You can use the raise hand function if you are on the blue jeans. If not, feel free to speak up. I don't see any raised hands right now. Let's see.
Well, I'm going to speak up, if that's okay.
Sure, Mr. Hilton, go ahead, please.
I spent quite a bit of time typing comments in, and I need to vocalize what I wrote. I've listened to all of this, and there's been a lot of focus on AAPI people. Don't get me wrong. I abhor the incidents to which Asians have been beaten and bruised and killed. But the data that you have, the data that the AG put out there shows that Black people are beaten the most and are subjected to most of the crimes. But the California Department of Justice went out and hired a team to stop crimes against AAPI. What about the Blacks? And I'm not talking about the crimes against the Blacks by the cops, because those are a special group. I resent this. I absolutely resent what I'm looking at, what I'm listening to. I think you're wasting my time and you're getting me angry, and I need to stop coming to this place. That's all I have to say today.
Are there any other members of the public who wish to make a comment? I don't see anything on blue jeans and not hearing anything, so I think you all can move to the next agenda item.
Allison's the next item, discussion of next steps.
Yes.
maybe you can give us some guidance in that area.
I think it's just, I have somewhat reiterated already some of the topics it looks like you all are interested in pursuing and discussing. So, sorry, I did not realize my camera was off. And so we can pursue some of those topics. And if you all have ideas about people you would like to, we have the full board meeting on March 30th, but if you all have ideas about people who you would be interested in hearing from at the next subcommittee meeting, we can help facilitate that. So please send them our way. The next subcommittee meeting after the full board meetings will likely be in late spring, early summer. And so for the next meeting, we can start doing some research and talking with all of you about, what's going on in your areas and what information you might have that we can share with the full subcommittee and think about, next steps in terms of developing the topics for the report. And so, I think we have a good sense of what you're all interested in, and we can look at resources. And if you all have people who you would be interested in hearing from, we can do some of that research too. But if you all have people that you'd be interested in or who you think would have valuable insight for the subcommittee, please let us know and we can work to connect with them before the next meeting.
Great, we'll be sure to do that. And we move to the next item, the election of a co-chair.
Sure.
Officer Hampton is retiring from the profession or from the board?
I'm retiring from the profession, but I'm going to pull an Aisha. I'll be a retired annuitant. I'll still be with my department for a little bit more. I'll still be that pain in the butt there. So they agreed to bring me back. So I'll still be there. I'll still have some involvement with some of the RIPA stuff. The guy that's going to take my spot for the PORAC will be sworn in, I believe, next month or so, but I'll still be available for the meetings and everything else like that. I'm this one, the cultural service is something I have a particular interest in because, again, my agency is doing a lot more than most. We're going to be upgrading a lot of different things. We have this PERT team. I want to make sure that we see all of that data come full circle and everything else like that. So I think you'll still see me around. I'll still be participating. I definitely want Anaheim to have some input on it because I think we do some things that might be unique, at least for an agency that's only 400, and I'm air quoting only 400 because we're surrounded by LAPD, which is 10,000. So it's our scale is not quite 10,000, but we do okay. But I'll still be around. I'll still be available to be contacted, and I'm definitely going to be setting up the Anaheim component for the calls for service and other RIPA components because we just started last year for our RIPA data collection as well. But I started in 1997 after 8 years in the United States Navy, and my boss, my wife, has said that it's time to hang it up. So I always listen to my boss. So
thank you for your lifetime of service, both to our country and to the city of Anaheim. It's fantastic, and to the RIPA board, and to PORAC, and to all the other. I think we should identify what you don't do versus what you do, because it seems that you do most everything. Well, we thank you for all that.
Congratulations, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Allison, is this a self-nomination process or co-chair?
It can be self, or it can be another member of the subcommittee. So anyone on the subcommittee can nominate anybody else to be a chair.
So I would like to nominate Manju if she's willing to to serve.
Thank you. Yes, and I would be willing.
A second.
Fantastic. Are there any other
Okay, so we have
nominations? I see and hear no other nominations. Are we good to bestow co-chairship upon Manju, Allison?
I think, do we have to formally vote on that to memorialize it in the minutes
Yes, please.
as parliamentary procedures there?
Yes. So,
And good way to go, Dr. Raphael. You've learned the art of volunteering someone else. Very good.
I will say that Steve is on 4 subcommittees and
Yes, he is. Yeah, I'm on several with him. Yes.
and chair of the board and one of the subcommittees. So he is definitely serving the board.
Many hats. Yes, many hats.
So we had a motion by Dr. Raphael, a second by Officer Hampton. All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed?
Aye.
I hear no opposed. The motion carries. Congratulations, Manju. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And thanks so much for former co-chair Hampton. And I look forward to serving in this capacity and getting to know all of you a little bit better. I think I came on the board with you, co-chair Ayub, and so looking forward to this new chapter.
As am I. Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate that. All right. I think that's the end of business. Is there anything else, Allison, from your point of view?
No, that's it.
Okay.
Everyone can have a little bit of time back, but thank you all for your participation. Congratulations, Officer Hampton. We really appreciate your service to the subcommittee and the board. I know we'll see you at another subcommittee meeting, so it's not a full goodbye yet, but we really appreciate your service to the Calls for Service subcommittee, and you will probably be getting some calls from us anyway, so we won't let you go completely. And congratulations, Manju. We're excited to have you as co-chair as well. And thank you all. We appreciate you all and appreciate the public's participation in these meetings. And we're looking forward to this next year and this next report. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you. Take